Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd. On this episode of the Watercourses of Hull, we're going to be taking a look at the Fordyke stream and its smaller tributary, the Lambwath stream. So, on the last Watercourses video, I started from the edge of town and worked my way in towards the River Hull, where the drain emptied into the river. But this time I'm starting the other way around. I'm starting next to the River Hull, near the North Bridge, where the Fordyke stream used to empty into the river, and where we can still see some of the evidence of it here on New Cleveland Street in the form of a buried bridge. Now, you might remember from the last video, buried bridges are one of the key signs still left of old drains, and this one is no exception. But this one's quite special. Lots of people have actually asked me about this one, and it's also one of the very first ferro-concrete bridges in the country, built in 1902. But of course, as with any of these old drains, once they were filled in, it was bundled underneath with aggregate and soil rather than just rip the bridge out and relay the road. It was much less disruptive to traffic. And so all we have left is this, the parapets of the bridge, still standing above the ground.
Looking at the satellite view, you can see a string of car parks and new buildings where the drain once ran from the river. Following it upstream, it turns sharply to the north just before Holborn Street. Here, it picks up again as a path that takes you from Spivey Street. In fact, you can see on the satellite view the marks on Spivey Street where the old drain used to be, and across St Mark Street and past the old gasworks where, until only a few years ago, stood East Hull's last gasometer.
And it's at this point here, just opposite the end of Holborn Street, that the old filled-in Fordyke stream stops becoming car parks and becomes once again a walkable path that you can follow most of the way to Bransholme. This is new since I was last here. You used to be able to just follow the cut all the way up that way, past the Reckitt's buildings, but now it's been diverted along there. So you can still get through. But it's not how I remember it from the last time I was round here. Must have been years since I was last down St Mark Street. I mean, it was. Last time I was down St Mark Street, there was a gasometer just over there. So that dates my last visit, doesn't it?
Still, it heads north, up to the roundabout on Mount Pleasant, where 50 years ago it once ran underneath the Victoria Dock Branch Line Railway and then the Hull and Barnsley Railway. From here, it drives a straight line up towards Bransholme as a clearly defined path, which instantly marks it out as an artificial drainage ditch rather than a natural stream.
So you may have noticed on the maps that the Fordyke stream is fairly straight. I mean, on the long term it's not Roman road straight, but it's straighter than any natural watercourse in this particularly flat area of land has any right to be. If you want to see a natural watercourse, just take a look at the course of the River Hull as it winds its way towards the city. No, this clearly is artificial, and that begs the questions: who built it, when and why? And to answer those questions, we have to go back quite a long way, about 1,000 years in fact, or very nearly.
Back in the 12th and 13th centuries, Holderness was little more than the floodplain of the rivers Hull and Humber, and the small village of Mews was even described as having an actual shoreline. When a group of Cistercian monks from Rievaulx Abbey settled in Mews to build their own abbey, they did so with an eye to draining the land and using the land to farm sheep. The wool trade was a big thing for England's economy in the Middle Ages, and, naturally, any good medieval clergy wanted in on this action. If there's one thing above all else that the medieval clergy loved, it was money. And God, but mostly money. But these monastic orders brought with them from Northern Europe the secrets of reclaiming low-lying marshland and set about creating a network of drains and ditches that would, eventually, make Holderness into the fertile plain that it is today. But it's probably not entirely true to say that the monks from Mews Abbey dug this particular ditch. During the enclosures, which was a time when common land was being taken, repackaged and then resold to wealthy landowners, who then employed the local villagers to work the land that they once worked for themselves, many ditches were redug and straightened in order to form more cohesive boundaries for the newly enclosed land parcels. And in the 18th century, some enterprising civil engineers renovated the drains of Holderness by building newer drains like Holderness Drain and the Beverley and Barmston Drain, which were larger and had steam pumps driving the water towards the Humber. During this period, many of the older, smaller drains were also upgraded or diverted.
Now it was here, at one point, that the drain encountered a cluster of railway lines and a bunch of bridges that crossed it. The Hull and Barnsley Railway, the Hull and Hornsey Railway, and the Victoria Dock branch line, which ran alongside it, just next to it here on an embankment. And of course, over time, and thanks to Dr. Beeching, almost all of those railways have gone, and the only one that's left is the Hull and Barnsley line, sitting on this bridge. Now it's the Hull Docks line, which ferries freight to and from King George Dock. But it's also here that the Fordyke stream splits and becomes the Fordyke stream, which runs onwards into Bransholme, but also the Lambwath stream that takes a turn east. And we're going to take a few minutes to go and have a look at the Lambwath stream and its own history, because I have some personal history with that.
The Lambwath stream ran alongside Dansome Lane and the later extension James Reckitt Avenue, passing underneath Summergangs Road and running along the north edge of East Park, skirting round the edge of the Boating Lake, and then hooking north, passing beneath James Reckitt Avenue to run alongside the west side of Mallet Lambert School and its playing fields. And it was here, in this spot, that my personal recollection of this drain comes into our story.
This, right here on James Reckitt Avenue, is the spot where the Lambwath stream hooked north and passed underneath the road. And this particular bit, unusually, wasn't filled in the 1960s like the rest of it. This was still open in the 1970s, and I know this because this particular stretch here, I remember. This road next to me here might be now the roadway to a small housing development, but back in the 70s and early 80s, it was a gravelly path to an area of urban decay. Some old brick outhouses with toilets in that had long fallen out of use, some what looked like old stables, and in front of them a wooden workshop that my granddad rented space in so that he could use some of his bigger tools like a lathe and a large circular saw. He called it the joiner's shop, and we would come here every Sunday morning. And it's astonishing because almost nothing is left of that at all, apart from this brick parapet, which used to be the bridge that carried Black James Reckitt Avenue over the Lambwath stream. But on a nice sunny day, I can still remember the trees and the sound of the wood pigeons on a Sunday morning.
The name Lambwath has been preserved in the name of Lambwath Road, but where does that name come from? The most popular explanation is that the monks used to wash the sheep in this stream on their way to Hull, making it a literal lamb wash, which then got corrupted into Lambwath over the centuries. These days, like the Fordyke stream, the Lambwath is gone, buried and diverted into newer drainage systems, and very little evidence of its existence remains to be seen, aside from a small handful of buried bridges like the one we just saw on James Reckitt Avenue, and a stretch of greenery and a path between Summergangs Road and Dornoch Drive. A line of trees here following the old path between Belfield Avenue and its final junction with the Holderness Drain. It was diverted into the Holderness Drain just near Saltshouse Lane in the 18th century, but it originally headed further east into the fields of Holderness.
But that's enough of the Lambwath stream, back to the Foredyke stream. After that railway tangle, it heads northwards in a straight line, and these days that entire line there is a path that takes you all the way to Bransholme, pretty much all the way from that Dansome Lane roundabout. At this point we come across a crossroads, a tree-lined muddy path that stretches in both directions straight across the Foredyke stream path. And it's at this point that a freight railway line used to cross over the Foredyke stream, spurring off the Hull and Hornsey Railway in that direction and heading in this direction across to a number of businesses on Stone Ferry Road that were serviced by this line. In fact, interestingly, in a road that was crisscrossed by many railway bridges, this is the only ground level crossing that crossed Stone Ferry Road. It wasn't used as frequently perhaps as some of the others. These days it's just a really pleasant walk for your dog. Now, a section of the Foredyke stream walk that I really enjoy is this, because of once upon a time the Foredyke stream would have run entirely through fields from its entire length, all the way from Mews Abbey all the way down to the city of Hull, or the town of Hull as it would have been back in those days. And it's kind of nice that here within the city itself we still have just a little bit of that sense of what that would have been like, the vistas that the monks would have seen as they went on their walks. Granted, it's playing fields, but it's technically still a field. Now, once you get past Leeds Road, the course of the Foredyke stream has kind of been overtaken by modern industrial development, and at this point I could probably have gotten away with calling this episode Snickets of Hull. It really is hemmed in on both sides with gates and industrial compounds and warehouses and car parks. Very different to what we've just been seeing before Leeds Road, that's for sure.
Once the Foredyke stream passes Sutton Road underneath what used to be a bridge, you're in Bransholme. When Bransholme was being built in the 1960s, the original plan had to build it as a town to ease the housing pressures caused by the massive damage to the city's housing during the last war. When it became clear that permission wouldn't be granted to create a whole new town, the estate was instead built as an extension of Hull. In keeping with the brutalist modern feel of the buildings, the bridges over the Foredyke stream were much less subtle than the old brick arch bridges. Two massive iron girder bridges carried Bude Road over the drain as it looped around, crossing the watercourse twice. One of these bridges still exists, but the other is gone. Local legend has it that these bridges were built by army engineers, which is entirely possible. The RAF Sutton base was basically being deconstructed at about the same time as Bransholme was being built. It's not far north of Bude Road, however, that we finally find a stretch of the stream that hasn't been infilled, running alongside Cumbrian Way.
And up here in North Bransholme, the stream surfaces once again with water and everything, and even a few shopping trolleys too, although what self-respecting drain doesn't contain a few shopping trolleys these days? And it heads out along a walk which I'm not going to attempt because it is a little bit boggy today, all the way out towards Holderness Drain, where this part of the stream empties into. That was something that happened during the 60s when they filled in most of the length of the stream. They simply diverted it into the Holderness Drain. On the other side of the Holderness Drain is the rest of the Foredyke stream, which stretches through the fields and junctions off with a couple of other drains and ends up indeed just south of Mews Abbey, which lends some credence to the story about this being a path that the monks would use to get from their abbey to Hull. For many years, when the 18th century renovations happened, there was actually a complicated aqueduct system where this drain actually passed over the Holderness Drain. But at some point that system was dismantled and both ends of the Fordyke stream just empty into the Holderness Drain. And standing here on the edge of it all, right on the edge of Hull, where from this point you can walk all the way alongside it into town, it makes me think maybe the drain isn't the important bit for us to remember. Maybe the important bit is this ancient path that the monks used to take as they brought their sheep to wash in the Lambwath and bring their wool to Hull to sell in the ports.